Hi, my name's Precious, and I'm going to be looking at the question of how will following Jesus change me? So you might feel drawn to follow God, but worry about what will be expected of you. Like, will you be able to do it? Will you be able to change in the way that's required? You may feel like, how am I going to stay in God's good books for the long run? And perhaps you worry that you're going to have to become this boring person and live this really narrow, restricted life. So let's take a look at what our expectations should be. I think to start with, it's really important to look at what happens in the moment that you become a Christian. So as you turn to Jesus and away from your own self and your own ways, you are instantly counted perfect before God. Now, if you've ever met a Christian, you'll know that doesn't mean that you are suddenly without any flaws, but in a very real sense, you are blameless before God. So how is that possible? Well, the core of becoming a Christian is actually receiving the gift of a perfect substitute taking your place. And it starts with this realization that our lives are in opposition to God. And in our broken state, there's no way we can approach his perfection. His law demands that as we have rejected him, the consequence and punishment of that is the death sentence that we are all under. But the good news is that before we even cared about God and while we were helpless in our own situation, God already had a rescue plan to reconcile us to himself. And that was the ultimate act of self-sacrifice. The Father sent the precious gift of his Son to live and die on our behalf and to clear the debt that was between us and God. And Jesus willingly took on all the horror and the sin of humanity's disobedience from God. And that satisfied the judgment of the Father, and the Father raised him to new life. So as a result, we are able to turn from our disobedience and through Jesus be reborn as blameless children of God. And Romans chapter 8, verse 1 basically summarizes the result of this. It says, "There's therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus." So you can see that whole plan of God wasn't based on our performance, but it was based on what Jesus did for us. So from that solid foundation, we can now look at the concern of how do we stay in God's good books, or what does God expect of us after becoming a Christian? Well, in the Bible, beyond the imagery of servant and master, there's imagery of our relationship with God as lover and beloved and friend. The most common imagery is father and child. So the story of the cross is actually so much bigger than just forgiveness or even behavior change. Actually, it's a story of adoption. And God's intention in all of this is to remove the obstacle of sin that is between us and him, and actually to bring us into a new life as his child. And if you think of the image of a child who has been adopted, they're instantly and officially like part of the family. But over time, they grow in their identity and their trust and knowing who they are in the family. So this family dynamic, it shows us that God is not looking for behavior change for its own sake, but actually he desires a relationship with us from the heart. And the superficial obedience, which is just performance, that was never what God was after. So the religious elite of Jesus' own day, they would strive to tick off every detail of the law, but it wasn't enough because it was their own external act. And actually, the perfect obedience which God desires is actually love. The greatest commandment, and the first commandment, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, and your soul. So if we're accepted in Jesus, as we've looked at, and God is transforming us, but it's all meant to be an inner change that is worked out, how do we gain that power and ability to change? Like, if it wasn't possible before, how can we now have inner change? Well, it's possible because as we step into that new life of Jesus, we become new creations and we have new hearts that are actually able to love God. And this plan was revealed even before Jesus came. So in Jeremiah 24:7, it said, "I will give them a heart to know me, for I am the Lord, and they will be my people, and I will be their God, for they will return to me with their whole hearts." So as new creations, we gain this heart that has a growing desire and a growing ability to live right before God. And we're also released from the power of sin, which was what held us captive. such that we were unable to love God or please God. And Romans 6:17-18 says, "But thanks be to God that though you used to be slaves to sin, you have come to obey from your heart the pattern of teaching that has now claimed your allegiance. You have been set free from sin and have become slaves to righteousness." So we've got a fundamentally changed relationship with sin. It's still possible to sin, but it's no longer the reigning power in our hearts. And in this change that happens internally within us, it's not just a passive thing. We actually have to engage with it and walk in the nature that God has birthed in us. And Galatians 5:16-17 says, "So I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh." 1 John 2 actually encourages us by reminding us that if we do sin, we have an advocate with the Father, which is Jesus Christ the righteous. But just a couple of verses later, it goes on to say, actually, our righteousness should be marked by growth. It says, "And by this we know that we have come to know him, if we keep his commandments." So does this whole process make us boring versions of ourselves? Is it really restrictive and narrow? Well, actually, through this whole thing, God is restoring his original design in us. So we were made in the image of God, and he gave us unique talents and personalities which are from God and for God. So now we're able to reorient our lives to actually use those things to worship him. And Romans 12:2 talks about this. It says, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect." So God's not looking to make clones. He's not looking to change us into someone else. This is not about becoming a boring version of ourselves. Actually, we are becoming the most alive version of ourselves possible. We have these boundaries that God lays out for us, but they're actually for us to flourish. And we have this freedom, which is not being bound in these chains of the law that are too heavy for us to carry. But actually, we have this law written in our hearts. And Galatians 5:13 says, "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge in the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love." So before we thought that, going our own way was freedom. Now we look and we see actually God was good all along. And it's coming from a place of relationship. So it's not a heavy, tight thing with rules. And even in Jesus' own words, so Matthew 11:30, Jesus says, "For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." So to finish, change is only going to be partial in this life. We're not going to be perfect. However, everything will be touched and changed in us. Although not utterly, we're promised that when we meet Jesus, we will become that finished article. 1 John 3:2 says, "Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is." Finally, just to encourage us, this whole thing is something that God is doing in us. It's his idea, and he is committed to us. In Hebrews, Jesus is described as the founder and the perfecter of our faith. So he starts this in us, but he empowers it and sustains it as we rely on him. Philippians 1:6 says, "And I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion in the day of Jesus Christ." Thanks for listening. Take care.